Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Tonight, I'm pleased to host Georgia Brady Barnhill to talk about her new book, Gems of Art on Paper, Illustrated American Fiction and Poetry, 1785 to 1885. I'm joined tonight also by AAS Director of Book History, Kevin Wisniewski. For newcomers here, I want to introduce the Society briefly. AAS was founded in 1812 by the printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera. And particularly relevant for tonight's program, our collections of graphic arts and especially illustrated books are much of the basis of Georgia Barnhill's book, which she'll be talking with us about shortly. In addition to virtual programs like this one, we offer visiting research fellowships, and we also welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own projects. The people who work on our projects include not just scholars in the traditional sense, but also artists, that is, creative and performing artists, as well as general readers. And I'm delighted to say we are once again welcoming readers by appointment. We're happy to present programs like this one free of charge, though of course running such programs isn't without expense. If you wish to help support programs like this one, a link to the Antiquarian Society's giving page will be available in the chat. Now, Kevin will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using for tonight's program. Kevin, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Scott. We are currently hosting this in Zoom webinar, and there are two functions I'd like to highlight for you. First, at the bottom of the menu bar, you'll see the chat function, where I will share some helpful links, including links to past and upcoming AAS programs, and to the publisher page where you can purchase the title in discussion tonight. We are also sharing a 40% off discount code for purchase of that title, so look out for that. Second, you'll see the Q&A function. In this feature, you can submit questions for our guest, and you can also vote questions already submitted up the queue. Following the talk, Scott will read off as many of those questions as time allows. Finally, I would like to let everyone know that this program is being recorded. For those who could not attend, the video will be made available on the Society's YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Kevin. And now it's a pleasure to introduce a longtime friend of my own and of the American Antiquarian Society. Georgia Brady Barnhill, known to all as Gigi, was the curator of graphic arts at AAS for more than 40 years, retiring in 2012. Gigi also established our Center for Historic American Visual Culture, also known as CHAVIC. It's fair to say, and it's no exaggeration to say, that Gigi put the American Antiquarian Society on the map as a center for the study of the visual. Through her decades of collecting American prints, illustrations, and other graphic material for the Society, and also through her own scholarship on American visual images and their makers. She co-authored AAS's 2012 exhibition catalog with a French accent, American Lithography to 1860, and she wrote essays in many of the Antiquarian Society's published books on American visual culture. Gigi has also taught many of us about the technologies of visual reproduction in 19th century America through her workshops in AAS's summer seminars and elsewhere, and also through her book, The Catalog of American Engravings, a manual for users. In other words, Georgia Barnhill's new book, Gems of Art on Paper, which was released just last week by the University of Massachusetts Press, is the product of a lifetime of learning and of prodigious research. Gigi, welcome. I know you're going to begin with a brief presentation about some key elements of the book, and then we'll talk for a bit before turning to questions from our audience. So Gigi, over to you. Please turn on your camera and your mic and take it away.
So thank you, Scott, for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Kevin, for being behind the scenes and getting this to work, I hope. And thank you all for being here. I don't know who you are or where you are. I know I have some friends, so hi, friends and family, but this is really a wonderful opportunity, although I'm sorry we're not under the dome. I want to say, first of all, how grateful I am to the Antiquarian Society for years of support on this project and many others. And also, I want to recognize, as Scott did, the vast collections of books, manuscripts, newspapers, periodicals that make research for so many of us possible. It's a fabulous resource. And I also want to thank the many people on the staff who during the last year and a half, 2 years, and before that, of course, but particularly during the pandemic, many people answered many silly questions for me, and I'm very appreciative of that assistance. What I hope to do this evening is to provide a quick overview of the book through its illustrations, which the book began as a lecture I presented at AAS in the early 1980s on illustrations for natural histories, technology, and literature, when the Society's program in the history of the book and American culture held its first summer seminar. I gave a presentation on Isaiah Thomas and his illustrated books that really piqued my interest. And within a couple of years, Mark McCorrison granted me a 3-month leave from AAS to conduct research in other repositories. Several years later, the Huntington Library gave me a month-long fellowship. And although I published a couple of articles on F.O.C. Darley and Augustus Hoppin, further research on the larger project was put off until I retired from AAS in 2012. Since then, I've worked on this book, not steadily, but as time and inclination allowed. Why tackle this subject? Illustrations matter to readers. Famed curator Frank Weitenkamp noted almost 100 years ago, the use of illustration to aid the laggard brain, to enliven the text, to add the force of visual instruction as a supplement to the text, began practically with the first use of printing. 50 years ago, in reference to 18th century British illustration, Edgar Breitenbach noted illustrations appeared, quote, to accentuate the climax of the action or to facilitate the understanding of especially difficult parts. And finally, Sonia Drimmer, in her recently published Art of Illusion, suggests that illuminations in certain early English texts by Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and John Lydgate led the aristocracy in Britain to accept English as a literary language, thus changing the trajectory of English literature. Arguably, American publishers responsible for handsomely illustrated books in the 19th century elevated those texts, helping to keep some titles in print for a long time and to create the literary canon. In short, illustrations matter. On a more personal level, I wanted to find a way to highlight a form of artistic cultural production. My ideal was to look for the intersections between authors, illustrators, and publishers. I've had some success on that, but that's very difficult. But illustrations in books spread the works of amateur and professional artists to a substantial and important segment of the public, paving the way for the greater appreciation of works of art, eventually leading to the establishment of our great public museums. Some of these books in the 19th century, though, served as portable museums, and families pored over them. As I watched the discipline of book history evolve, I realized that little attention in this country was paid by book historians to illustrations, and I sought to remedy that. For literary historians, discussing illustrated 19th century texts requires the acquisition of a new language and a new frame of reference. And finally, art historians traditionally have preferred to work on fine art, although happily this attitude is changing. In today's image-saturated environment, it's difficult to imagine a reading public starved for pictures. But in the years preceding the Revolutionary War, that pleasure was primarily limited to wealthy Americans who had access to illustrated books and prints imported from England. The rest of the public saw only small woodcuts in chapbooks and almanacs and on broadsides. Independently printed engravings were expensive luxuries. Newspapers sometimes included allegorical images as part of an ornamental title and small stock cuts of ships and buildings to accompany advertisements, but there were no images of current events, political figures, or places. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, illustrations in literary texts, few in number and small in size, were genuine works of art, reproductions of drawings by amateur and professional artists. As the 19th century progressed, the era's critics and journalists occasionally referred to carefully crafted images as, quote, gems of art. After the Revolution, American printers began to publish the works of their fellow citizens. These first steps towards the creation of an American literary culture were encouraged by writers such as Jedediah Morse. In his American Universal Geography, he noted, and I quote, "Before the Revolution, Americans seldom pretended to write or to think for themselves. We humbly received from Great Britain our laws, our manners, our books, and our modes of thinking, and our youth were educated as subjects of the British king, not as citizens of a free and independent republic," end quote. So with that introduction, I'm going to, I hope, share my screen and we'll get some pictures up. Oh dear. Well, so there are 4 chapters in this book, and the first chapter is devoted to the publication of poetry from 1785 to 1820. In chapter 1, I reveal the challenges facing American publishers from 1785 to 1820, including the quality and popularity of poetry, as well as the availability of engraving tools, equipment, and supplies. In this period, there were only 2 methods of reproducing images available: inexpensive primitive relief cuts, such as the vignette on this title page, or expensive, labor-intensive copperplate engravings, as seen in this image. Thus, publishers had to weigh their decisions carefully in order to obtain and maintain financial stability. This chapter is arranged to introduce the players in every illustrated book: publishers, authors, artists, illustrators, and engravers. Some of the efforts fell short of artistic perfection, but they provide a baseline. Noteworthy in this period is the absence of critical attention to the images. Chapter 2 considers illustrations created for literary annuals, an important publishing genre that introduced thousands of readers to short stories and poetry by American authors and to fine engravings and lithographs. After the first British annual appeared in 1822, the vogue for this book format spread quickly to the United States, and American annuals flourished into the 1850s. The introduction of 2 new graphic processes, and I'm showing you a lithograph, which is one of the new processes, and engraving on steel, made it possible for publishers to print large editions of lithographs and engravings of up to 10,000 impressions from one matrix or printing surface. Because of such advantages, publishers were able to commission engravings that reproduced drawings and paintings by significant American and European artists, thus creating volumes that served as portable museums. This chapter includes information on publishers, artists, engravers, and writers, technological innovations such as steel and mezzotint engraving, as well as lithography, the Atlantic souvenir, for which incredibly complete financial records exist, and illustrations as reproductions of paintings, the circulation of engraved plates, and reception and good taste. Childhood is a steel engraving by George W. Hatch after a painting by the popular artist Henry Inman. Inman opened his own studio in 1821, but became a publisher of lithographs in Philadelphia in 1831. After 2 years, he returned to painting full-time. The engraver, George Hatch, was trained by Asher B. Durand and was primarily a banknote engraver, occasionally doing steel engravings for literary annuals. Another innovative process that came to the fore in this period was mezzotint engraving, and it became popular by the efforts of John Sartain, an engraver trained in England who produced hundreds of mezzotints beginning in 1831. The process began with a prepared plate on which the engraver used a burnisher to create the light areas. So it's less labor intensive actually than copperplate engraving. In chapter 3, I consider the work of 5 illustrators who emerged at a time when professional training for illustrators was not yet standardized. David Claypool Johnston, whose life dates are 1799 to 1865, Hammett Billings, 1816 to 74, Felix Octavius Carr Darley, 1822 to 88, Augustus Hoppin, 1828 to 96, and Thomas Nast, 1840 to 1902. All had successful careers. Until the establishment of schools such as the New York School of Design in the 1850s, illustrators received occasional instruction or criticism from painters, or were largely self-taught. On their own or with the help of drawing manuals or tutors, they worked to develop a knowledge of perspective, anatomy, and compositional principles. Their work was aided in this era by the introduction of stereotype and electrotype technology, which meant that printers did not have to keep type standing for future printing, and relief blocks remained in good condition. Multiple printing matrices could be produced by these methods, making it possible to issue popular books more quickly and inexpensively. I picked 5 illustrators for this chapter, largely based on my knowledge of their work. And David Claypool Johnston was actually, we have a fabulous collection of his drawings and manuscripts at AAS. And he was the first graphic artist whom I got to know through an exhibition back in the late 60s. So he was a natural for me. This is a drawing and the subsequent engraving, which he did himself, very unusual. He could engrave, etch, work on wood, draw, paint, teach. He was an amazing person. And let me just show you one engraving with a detail based on a design by F.O.C. Darley. He was incredibly prolific and popular and successful. AAS has his account book, which shows that he received over $2,000 from the firm that initiated this massive publication project, 30 volumes of James Fenimore Cooper's novels published between 1859 and 61. Townsend started it, and his successor was James G. Gregory. The series included 500 illustrations, 60 of which were engraved on steel, and the others were on wood. A German-trained engraver, Friedrich Gersch, joined 6 other engravers to produce these elegant images. Several of these engravers were trained in England, 2 were American-born, and Gersch was, of course, trained in Germany. The publisher advertised that the total cost of illustrations was about $20,000. Fourth chapter, in a way, is my favorite one. It really consists of some of my favorite books in the AAS collection. It's a little self-serving, but it does examine in some detail the incorporation of reproductions of fine art into volumes of poetry between 1840 and 1885. These gift books replaced literary annuals that had gone out of fashion before the Civil War. And publishers began to issue elegantly printed gift books that featured the work of renowned artists such as Winslow Homer, John Cavalier, David Huntington, Emanuel Leutz, Asher B. Durand, as well as America's leading writers, including William Cullen Bryant, John Greenleaf Whittier, Nathaniel Parker Willis, Anne Lynch Boda, Washington Irving, and of course, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I organized this chapter by reproductive process: engraving and etching, wood engraving, lithography and color printing, and photography. Some publications in this era were were issued in editions limited by complex color printing technology. And others were issued in large editions because of the introduction of electrotyping for wood engraved blocks. This illustration was drawn by William Woad and engraved by Andrew Varick Stout Anthony for a book by Longfellow, Flower de Luce, published in 1867. Anthony was an incredibly skilled wood engraver and actually became a member of the Century Club in New York, which was highly selective, and that was quite an honor. Anthony was described by a contemporary as much more than an engraver, though, illustrator or designer. He was a maker of books. In an interview, he explained that sometimes a year was required for the production of a gift book. We forget how complicated these books could be, beginning with the initial design. For example, it was decided for one book that each section of the poem had to end on a right-hand page. It was easier to insert cuts into pages of narrative text than to wrap poetry around images, as was done in some gift books. After designing the layout, Anthony worked closely with artists and then engravers who worked more slowly than the artists. Once the sizes and placement of the images were determined, the images and text went to the printers. Printing for these publications was done with much care and without haste upon carefully selected paper. Before publication, advance copies went to agents, dealers, and the press. Anthony noted that engravers in the post-Civil War era earned $2,500 to $7,000 a year, which is really pretty good. One of the most elegant books published in the early 1880s was Poets and Etchers, published in Boston by Tickner and Company in 1881. It contains 20 etchings and additional wood engraved vignettes. This etched plate by James David Smiley, one of those who edited the volume, illustrates a poem by Thomas B. Aldrich. This was in an edition limited to about 1,000 copies, and it probably did not make a profit for those who collaborated on the project. Other artists represented in the volume included Albert F. Bellows, Samuel Coleman, Henry Farrar, and Robert Swain Gifford, all well-known painters who experimented with the etching process in the 1870s. The process enabled artists to draw freehand on prepared copper plates. The lines were etched chemically and then printed like standard engraving. So this is a big change from the degree of skill and difficulty using a very sharp engraver to actually incise lines into copper plates. And you can see in the detail on the right how freely drawn some of these lines are. And this is an artist just, working on the plate, probably out of doors. And the results are really quite stunning. So what I've given you is a very brief introduction to some of the pictorial material. And I think now Scott and I can have a conversation. We can bring up some other aspects of this book, but at least you have a little sense of the focus of the text.
Thank you, Gigi. This is great. And I really enjoyed reading this book last weekend. I just think there's so much here about the relationships between the different people involved in making these books and about the business and the art of making them. And one of the relationships that interests me a lot is the relationship between the visual and the verbal texts. In this book, you're writing about books in which there are both the visual illustrations and poetry or prose of some sort, fiction and poetry. And I found it fascinating as you explain it, that in some cases, the artists painted, the painter and engraver created the picture first, which meant that the poem or the story was written to illustrate the visual image, not the other way around. How did these relationships between the verbal and the visual work in these books?
Oh gosh, after I retired, Nan Wolverton put together a wonderful conference on moving images. And I gave a paper on sort of on this topic, which was printers and publishers sometimes, to save time, would simply obtain a printing plate, a pictorial plate, and put another identification with it. So in the colonial period, you'd have, George Washington, but they weren't George Washington. They were other people. Good heavens, some of them could have been British stock cuts imported into the colonies. But what happened with publishing for a lot of this time? So periodical illustrations had pretty strict deadlines. I mean, publishers needed the plates to be printed and ready to insert in the text by a certain date. So they often would acquire plates that had been used in literary annuals. And there were these big book trade sales held in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. And usually books were being sold, but if you go through enough of those catalogs, you find that they're also selling engraved plates. So that's one way that the engravings would move from one publisher to another, sometimes a publisher of a literary annual to another publisher of literary annuals, or sometimes to a periodical publisher. And it wasn't too difficult to change the title on the image. You just simply turn the plate over and pound it with a hammer, and it flattens out, and then an engraver can put in a new title. I mean, it sounds wacky, but they did that. And the other thing to keep in mind, there's some correspondence, commissioning illustrations, and some writers did not like to write to a previously existing illustration. So some pretty important poets would just turn down commissions like that. So I mean, there was just an incredible amount of confusion. One of the great projects at AAS that made my life a lot easier in this regard was cataloging the literary annual engravings. And Christine Graham did that project single-handedly over quite a few years. I mean, she didn't do it overnight. It was well over 3,000 items. But her visual memory was so good that when she saw a picture of a woman holding a bouquet of flowers, she could kind of say, wait a minute, I've seen that before. And then she would do keyword searches and be able to link the same image with two different titles that often came with two different literary texts. So for literary historians who look at this material, they may say, but this illustration has nothing to do with the text or is off base. That's why. And it's complicated to understand it. And but it's wacky. I love it. It's so much fun to figure these things out.
It's great stuff. And Christine just wrote in the chat, thanking you for those words. And by the way, you should just know, Gigi, that the chat is full of people saying hello to you and greeting you.
Lord.
It's a lot of fun.
It's going up.
Which is great. And I think that, what you describe in one case is, I think the visual image has three children, and the poem that it refers to talks about two children, because there just was sometimes that mismatch. It's interesting to me that in some cases it's the artist who is more prominent than the poet or the writer, and the appeal of these books might very well be for the visual images much more than in some cases for the poetry. They're not all Longfellow,
right? But there's a lot of the woman who indexed this book complained at one point You have more personal names in this book than any text I've ever indexed. And it's because of the range of poets and illustrators and engravers. I mean, there's just a lot of people walk through this.
Yeah. My sense from your research and your examples is that book illustration in the 19th century was a vital source of economic support for artists, as well as for engravers, lithographers, printers, and others in a society without a lot of other options for artists.
Right. I mean, what's kind of interesting is to follow, and I couldn't do as much of it as I wanted. I mean, there's a vast amount of research to be done particularly on the engraving trades and lithographic trades as well, but particularly the engravers. If a youngster started out wanting to draw, finding that stub of a pencil and using the back of a receipt or some whatever, as is recorded by some of these people, what are they going to do? And sometimes, I mean, like F.O.C. Darley would have been drawing as a youngster. And in fact, the Folger Shakespeare Library has a little book of some of his early drawings. So what is he going to do as a career? So his parents apprentice him to be a clerk in the Philadelphia Dispatch Company. And there's a drawing, maybe at Yale, actually on the verso of one of those bills of lading from that company. But, it happens that, he gets discovered by a Philadelphia publisher and someone needs an illustrator. And Darley's been doing these drawings, character sketches, and he finally gets employment by Carey and Hart, and his career just goes off and running, and he illustrated probably more books than anybody else in the 19th century America.
Yeah, he just took off. Yeah. We have a question along similar lines from John Lawrence Bush about the economics. He asks, could you please discuss more broadly the cost and talent necessary to create wood engravings in the early 19th century? How widespread was this talent in early 19th century America?
Actually, there are two separate things. The illustrator is the artist who has the creative ability, the imagination to read a text and create a design. And then that's turned over to the engraver. And there are various ways to transfer the drawing to the engraving block. But if it's a wood engraving, the material is, I won't say, it's manageable. I mean, I think with a lot of practice, probably most people could actually engrave on wood. I had to do one in college, and I've not yet I still have the block, and it's pretty cute, and it would make a great holiday card. And so one of these days I'm going to use it. And I am a klutz at drawing, and actually made a pretty decent, woodcut. Engraving's more difficult because it just takes such a steady hand, and the material is, it's just very hard to take an engraving tool and kind of go into the copper and come up and then keep doing it over and over and over again to get cross hatching. But, it's like doing anything well. You just practice. And they were good careers.
And they were good careers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who were the audiences for the books you're looking at? Some of them were produced in large runs. Others were produced in very small runs. Who's reading these things as far as we can tell?
Well, there's actually one of my favorite books is by Clarissa Badger, and it's not a great book. It's got she wrote some poetry, and I'm sure literary historians would. There is one poem by Lydia Sigourney who introduces the volume, but it's a book of kind of poetry about flowers. And Emily Dickinson's father gave the poet a copy of this book, which was great because Emily Dickinson loved flowers. The homestead has a wonderful garden. And, so there's one reader who actually probably paid attention to this book. And actually, Emily Dickinson wrote a poem on the harebell, very different from the one that's in this book. But I think the audience for, certainly for the literary annuals, there were so many published. And, they were small, they were expensive, but they were the kind of books that, men would give to, their fiancés, their, mothers, their sisters, uncles would give them to, their nieces. I mean, it's very broad distribution. They were expensive. So these are books. Most of these books were for people who had the leisure to read and some money to spend. Some of them were truly expensive. The color plate book, Pearls of American Poetry, a book like that was costing $10. The one that Emily Dickinson owned had hand-colored lithographed plates that the author, she did it all. She drew the plates and then she hand-colored them, something like 20,000 impressions. That book sold for $12.50 or $15 according to the binding. And I somehow love dollars and cents and how much all of this stuff costs. So I'm just going to tell you a couple of things. William Sidney Mount from October 1843 through April 1844 paid $60 to rent 2 rooms in New York City. So board was an additional $60, furnishings cost $35. And about the same time, the engraver John Cheney was earning $250 for each engraving he did for Carey and Hart. So $250 would have rented that space in New York for quite a while. Yeah. And that was pretty good. Earlier in the period, AAS has, of course, the account books for Matthew Carey. And I was looking for something one day and couldn't find what I wanted, but it was pretty cool. Carey paid one engraver $3 a day. So this is around 1809, 1810. A book that he published with 6 engravings cost 62.5 cents. Carey paid Samuel Falwell $11.90 for engraving 14 type metal cuts. So these would have been probably small illustrations for some kind of a manual or who knows what. But Carey paid William Neese $16 to engrave 2 designs. So that, I think, gives you a sense of, one, the relative status of engraver on metal versus wood engraver, but also the relative cost of the 2 kinds of prints.
Does it become over the course of the century that you trace, more possible for both the artists and the engravers to make a living in this world?
Oh yeah, definitely. The illustrators I talk about, Johnston, Hoppin, and chapter 3, Nast. Actually, I went to FOC Darley's house in Claymont, Delaware, a bunch of years ago. It was a B&B, the Darley B&B. Very nice house. So, he clearly did well. And if you look at his account book, you can do the dollars and cents. He was a busy illustrator, but he was also selling paintings and exhibiting. So, he was making some money. Thomas Nast actually died penniless, but that was because he made lousy financial investments. But he too owned a very handsome house in Morristown, New Jersey, which I think still exists. And it's they weren't living in the slums of New York. They were doing well.
Yeah.
And Johnston's house was in Dorchester, and again, a very nice, a nice house.
Yeah.
I knew someone who'd visited there, and so I mean, if you look at kind of, if you do the cost of living translations of dollars in 1840 to dollars now, I mean, they range all over the map. I mean, it's either $100 to one, or it's $20,000 to one. I don't know. It sounds like Bitcoin to me, but looking at housing costs and the way these artists lived was interesting. Samuel Avery was another wood engraver who started out, apprenticed to another wood engraver. He learned his stuff, but he ran off to California in the 1840s, early 50s, came back to New York, worked as a commercial engraver. The Met has a nice scrapbook they've digitized with proofs of his engraving skills. He ended up as a art collector, dealer, and philanthropist. He was one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and also the Avery Library at Columbia is named after him. So, and he started out with that little wood engraving tool. Yeah. So yeah, there was room to move upwards in terms of financial stability. Absolutely.
And was there also a whole cadre of either artists or engravers who were more like working class people, just doing this to crank things out for kind of subsistence, more of subsistence wages? When
Sure.
Below the world of the Darleys and the Nasts, who were kind of they were the stars. And
well, there were one name that appears once in a while in the book is Nathaniel Orr. His surname is Orr, and he probably started out modestly as a wood engraver, but he ended up having like a factory of wood engravers working for him. And my hunch is that these were the engravers who were probably doing better than subsistence, but not too much better. But they would have had food on their table and had families, and they did all right. They maybe didn't have the nice house out in the suburbs, but they could make a good living. I mean, that article that said engravers earned around in the late 60s, 1860s, between $2,000 and $7,000 a year. That's a pretty good living, I think.
Yeah. That's not bad in that era.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. One of the recurring themes of your book is that the history of illustration in the United States was not solely an American story. It's inextricable from developments in England and France.
Yeah. As I said to you a little while ago, I thought I was going to tell an American story. And one of the readers of the manuscript said, you really should kind of not focus on, but certainly introduce the importance of the transfer of technology from the other side of the pond to the United States. And then as I looked more closely, I also realized that many of the engravers who worked in the United States were in fact trained in England and brought substantial skills. I mean, I have a feeling that George Putnam brought some engravers over from England just to do one of his great landscape books, because suddenly these two engravers appear, and that same year, this book comes out with their engravings. And that doesn't really, it kind of surprises me, but then not really, because there weren't enough skilled engravers to fill the need. And, and I think the Cooper project, probably a couple of the engravers for that were brought over specially. But yes, it's, and of course the technology is, a lot of British and French.
Yeah.
And they also, I should say, for the literary annuals, there are a lot of copies of European prints and illustrations in that genre.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it works on iconography as well as people, as well as technology.
Exactly. So many
Yeah.
levels. It's
Yep.
transatlantic, truly.
It is.
And so I'm going to turn to questions. We have a bunch of questions here. So I'll ask, this is a question from Susan Strickler. Wasn't it harder for publishers to find good artistic talent to create the designs?
I think, I don't know about the word harder. I think one thing that's really interesting is in New York, for example, the Century Club was a meeting place for leading publishers, authors, and artists, and even engravers, which really surprised me, but there were a few. So, I mean, I think there were casual networks that emerged, and that was one of really on the most elite scale. But Thomas Nast, Thomas Gunn, I believe was his name. He was a British illustrator who kept a very detailed diary for like a decade in New York. And he records how Thomas Nast and other illustrators had to go from publisher to publisher to publisher to find work. So it's a mixed story. I don't know that it was hard for, the publishers to find talent, but they had to pay for it. And sometimes they wanted it for free. Carey and Hart, I think, the Careys acquired art, like buying paintings from William Sidney Mount, but their account books, really for like the Atlantic Souvenir, do not record large payments to artists. They do for engravers. Okay. But, they're borrowing paintings, they're buying them from themselves. I mean, it's a real mix, but
yeah. We have several questions here about these networks. Naomi, and I'll bundle some of them together. Naomi Perry asks, how closely did the illustrator and then the engraver work with the author, if at all? And Virginia Westbrook asks, have you been able to glean any sense of agency? Who made the decisions about what illustrations went onto the page? So two different questions about these networks. Who's making decisions? What are the relationships between the authors and the illustrators and engravers?
It's interesting. I was told by one scholar of more contemporary current practice that often there was no collaboration. There is today very little collaboration between artist and author. In the 19th century, there is evidence of collaboration. The agency, the freedom to figure out what to illustrate. We do have some good letters. I think it's between David Claypool Johnston and the Carey and Hart, where in some cases it seems Johnston is allowed to pick what he wants to illustrate. Other times authors will make suggestions, here are my favorite 5 things to focus on. And that, of course, makes it really easy for the illustrator, because that means reading 5 short passages,
right,
and going to work. And that's the advantage of illustrating a poem. I mean, they're short.
Right.
And so I don't know, does that answer?
I think so.
Question all right?
I think so.
It really varies. There's a lot that's in flux, I think, at this time.
Yeah, I think that's clear from the book, that just the variety of kinds of arrangements, and you've discovered so many of them through your archival work, in these account books and other materials, just so many different kinds of relationships that emerge from the documentary record.
Yeah, it's been fun to do the piecemeal
Kathy,
research.
Kathy Guerin Christie asks, are the gift books you spoke of the books that were produced for early Christmas gifts in the early 19th century?
So some scholars use the term gift books to include literary annuals and these elegant kind of one-off books that I talk about in my final chapter. And I've tried to separate these into two genres. The literary annuals are those that they started publication here in the mid 1820s, but they're issued in series. So Carey and Lee published the Atlantic Souvenir for seven years in a row. And a lot of other publishers had long runs of these annuals. So it's, the same title, but for 1827, for 1828, The later ones published after that last chapter covers 1840s up to 1880s. Those are all gift books. I mean, those were published for gift giving, but not in series. They're
one-offs.
One-offs,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So it varies.
Yeah. Robert Eskin is thinking of a book in 1873 in which almost all the 170 illustrations were copied from previous illustrations. How common was that? He asks. See Samuel Hazard, Santo Domingo, past and present. Sounds as though, from what you've said already, there was a fair amount of recycling of images here.
I think that's a huge example. I'd love to see that book. But yeah, I mean, a publisher could buy. So let me think, who was it that did that so much? Samuel Atkinson, who published The Casket, which was a periodical. He acquired probably 60 illustrations or more from earlier Philadelphia periodicals, like the Portfolio. And then he buys these plates. He puts a new little line on them, published for The Casket, and then they reappear in the 1830s. But those were not single volumes. I mean, that was the periodical. But to have 170 engravings, I mean, that's a pretty staggering size book anyway.
It would be, yeah. Jay Melby asks, can you compare Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia in terms of artistic production? And maybe more broadly, well, as you were doing the research, geographically, where is this work most concentrated? Is it in all the different publishing centers? Are there places that are more centers of this work?
It varies so much, sort of decade by decade. I mean, I think in Philadelphia, I think that was really one of the great centers of production early on. It may have kind of lagged a little bit, after the Civil War. But by then, I mean, New York has Putnam and Harper's, which were huge publishing houses. And Boston and Ticknor and Fields, about the time of the Civil War, they get really serious about illustrated books. So they're churning out huge numbers of them.
And they're associated with a lot of the major figures in American poetry as well.
Exactly. So their books are amazing. And the Ticknor and Fields cost books are at the Houghton Library. And, you can have a field day doing the dollars and cents for those. But I mean, it's a great question, Julie. I'm going to be giving a talk at the Boston Athenaeum, I think, next month. And I'm probably going to just focus on Boston publications because you get, it starts with Isaiah Thomas, what's not to like about that, but they're publishers in Boston of literary annuals and goes right through the whole period. Hammett Billings, I mean, that's where Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, I mean, it's a great center, but, certainly Carey and Lee, Carey and Hart, Carey, Lee and Hart, and, then Lippincott. I mean, that's a great story too.
It is, yeah.
We'll get to work on that.
We have a very specific question from David Wright, which I'll make into more general. David asks, does AAS have any archival material on AVS Anthony? And I could broaden that out and just ask you to say something about the research that went into this. Where did you go? Where did you find stuff?
So back in 1986, I had a couple of nice grants from the American Philosophical Society and the Bibliographical Society of America. And then AAS gave me a paid leave, which was pretty fabulous. So that summer, I did a lot of work at the Houghton Library. I did a road trip to a conference in Washington and spent time with friends in Princeton, New Jersey. Bill and Carol Joyce were there by then, and my predecessor, Louise Marshall, had moved to Philadelphia, where Gordon was employed at the library company. So I spent time with them. It was just a wonderful time. So a lot of my research was done back then, pencil on paper, thank heavens, because I still could read my notes and they were pretty accurate. And then I spent a lot of time that summer at the New York Public Library and did very little at AAS, thinking, oh, well, I'll pick up that stuff later. Well, that was pretty naive of me. The AAS resources are phenomenal. You begin with Isaiah Thomas, you've got his stock account books, so you can tell how badly or well books sold by how much was left over 20 years later. There are wonderful letters that show that he and his partner are modeling their productions in the 1790s on British models. You get David Claypool Johnston. That huge collection is phenomenal. We have F.O.C. Darley's account book, which was a relatively recent acquisition. We have an account book of a lithographer named Charles Parsons, who starts in commercial lithography, but ends up as a respected artist whose works are reproduced in books that I mentioned in chapter 4. In his account book, it gives, how much money he's spending to buy art supplies. What's not to love about that, to watch this commercial lithographer?
Yeah, just work. Yeah,
at work. And then there were, just wonderful collections in all kinds of places. A friend of mine, Sue Rainey, sent me on to the Orr family papers in Florida. And, it just happened. I wrote for, 12 letters that seemed like they might be of interest. And darned if one of them wasn't about one of my favorite books. The serendipity of it all is amazing.
We have questions are now coming in, of course, as we're running out of time, but I'll try to ask a few more because I know that people want some answers. Diana Korzenik mentions 1820s homemade portable museums, scrapbooks of collected print seem a response to the printed illustrated books. People want to make their own books. Yes, is that a response to print?
Yes. Yeah. And it's showing how these books are cherished. And there's a wonderful passage in that chapter 2, about a young woman who opens up her gift book and doesn't want to get it too close to the fire because the boards might warp, and the little sibling comes up. No, no sibling hands on this book. But yeah, women collected these images, we assume mostly women, and put them in scrapbooks, and some copied them in other media too, which is a reader response in a way.
Yeah, and that connects to Richard Flint's question. Right, Sarah Fuller's Manual of Instruction in the Art of Wood Engraving is an early instructional manual and by a woman. Were there other manuals predating hers, and how common were women in the illustration business, and what was their role and influence?
I really don't know much about the manuals, so let's not even try to test my memory on that. There were women illustrators. Mary Halleck Foote was probably one of the most prominent. and she illustrated for Ticknor and Fields. Her husband was a mining engineer, and she had studied at the New York School of Design and went west with her husband. And she still continued to provide illustrations for Ticknor and Field. And her papers are at the Huntington Library, and her life formed the basis for the Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner. Yeah, I have those all in a little part of my bookshelf. Angle of Repose, the Huntington published a book about her. And there were other women illustrators, but I'm not going to be able to come up with any names.
Right.
But they were there. I mean, there was a school of design training women to be illustrators and engravers.
Right.
They also sometimes in Philadelphia were known as, to color lithographs by hand, which was a form of artistic production as well. Mm-hmm. So they're there.
Yeah, I'm going to finish up with a question from Bob Kosofsky, which brings us sort of into the present day. He says, projecting today's graphic novel back into history, are there any 18th and 19th century examples of primarily graphic narratives, perhaps something in AAS's collections?
There are some. There's one about, it's a narrative about Western travel to the gold rush. And I'm not going to think of I could go find it, but you'd see me disappear into my, background. And David Claypool Johnston actually produced something he called scraps, which were, like 8 to 12 etched vignettes on a page that all relate to a certain subject. So in a way, it's not a novel, but it's a graphic sequential thing, but not like a flip book. So there are some, not many.
Right. And one of the great takeaways from your book, when you compare the world that you're writing about with the world we live in now, we are just surrounded by and suffused with images. And small cities as well as large have art museums where we can go and see art. And what you make so clear in the 19th century is that for so many Americans, these illustrated books were their museums. They were the place where people learned how to look at visual images, because there wasn't a museum in every city. In fact, there were very few museums in the early period. And I think your book gives us a window onto this world in which the illustrated books themselves were America's museums.
Right. Well, I thank you. I'm glad it comes through clearly, because
it does. It's a terrific book, and I recommend it to everybody. It's Gems of Art on Paper, Illustrated American Fiction and Poetry, 1785 to 1885. It's part of the University of Massachusetts Press's series on the studies in print culture and the history of the book, which is a great series from the UMass Press with lots of great books about the histories of books, reading, publishing, and illustration, particularly in American history, but also more broadly. Our hour has gone very quickly here, and it's drawing to a close. It's been great. And Gigi, I want to thank you so much for this stimulating conversation, and to thank everybody who's been watching.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody for those wonderful questions. And I look forward to reading the chat. I think I can print it out, right?
Yes, and I think Kevin can save it for you too. And for those of you who've been watching, if you want to recommend the program to friends, our public programs are available on the AAS YouTube channel. So pretty soon this program will be available on YouTube as well. This is our last virtual program for the fall. It's been a great fall full of programs. We're planning an active slate of programs beginning again in January. I want to highlight one of those right now because I think it will appeal to many of the folks who are watching tonight. On January 19th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we have a program called How to Save a Circus Poster, Collection, Conservation, Context, about a remarkable project here at AAS over the past 2 years. If you found a box containing a jumbled pile of old crumpled paper, would you keep it? You might, if you knew it would turn out to be a 12-foot tall circus poster that includes the earliest known depiction of a circus ring. So you can join Babette Genrich, who's our chief conservator here at AAS, Lauren B. Hughes, who's our vice president for collections, and Matthew Whitman, curator of the Harvard Theater Collection at the Houghton Library, for the story behind salvaging this 1838 poster printed by Jared W. Bell of New York and intended for display on buildings lining the parade route of an early traveling menagerie. This program will closely examine the complicated conservation work that was required to stabilize and piece together this enormous piece of ephemera, and it's also its implications for what we know about early American entertainment and circuses. That's in January, on January 19th. The week after that, we will have the first of our spring or winter and spring history of the book talks with Matthew Kirschenbaum talking about bit streams. And on that same evening, January 27th, the historian Thavolia Glimpf will join us for a public program on her award-winning book, The Women's Fight, The Civil War Battles for Home, Freedom, and Nation. So lots coming up. Please watch the AAS website for announcements of these and more programs to come. But for now, thanks so much. Have a good evening and a wonderful holiday season. Thanks, Gigi, and thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone.